It's just great to come out of the elevator and hear the sounds of people in the auditorium. It's so wonderful to see everyone. I'm just going to make a technical announcement. Where the classes are this morning. So we're in the auditorium. At 10:20, Rachel Danziger is going to be in room 1. In her class on Shmot. Rabbi Shani Targum will be here in the auditorium. At 11:45, the third class of the day, Nechama Goldman Barish will be here in the auditorium. Okay? Sorry. Okay, so that's and there will be a list outside. There were a couple of questions about that. Okay. Right. Good morning to everyone on Zoom. Yeah. Oh, the second class in room 1. Room 2. Oh, room 2. Who just said that? Like that people know, right? Room 2. My Hebrew class will be in room 2. Okay. Okay. So welcome back. Welcome to our new year here at Matan. To our class from Abram to Avraham. We're starting actually with Parshat Be'erah, which is where we left off last year. It's wonderful to start the new year with a new Chodesh, right? This morning, saying Hallel, beginning our year with the beginning of Cheshvan. I think it's also wonderful that it rained this morning. Did it? You know, the rain, the Shefa, the Bracha, the Torah, right? We're starting this new year. It should be a year of Hashem answering all of our tefillot, not just Mashim HaRuach U'Marid HaGeshem. We should have good health. We should have good news. And please, I'm reminding everybody, share with me your good news. I love to start out the morning mentioning people's good news. Also, you on Zoom, please share with me your good news. I much prefer that. Than what I'm going to say now, which is that our shiur this morning is dedicated in memory of our beloved student, Myrna Sternfield. Okay, so Mindel Reisel Tzivia, Yehi Baruch. I think everybody here, certainly who has been in the class, even once, right? I see her here, right? She sat right there. And I'm going to read a short dedication from her daughter, Esther Grunhut. Myrna, she was just such a warm and vibrant presence, right? And I think, she's really missed. I see people nodding. So I'm going to read what Esther wrote and asked me to read. She said, my mother, Myrna Zichronali Bracha, started taking courses in Matan about 15 years ago. I think she started a couple of years before retirement, and she came on Wednesdays, which was her free day from work. Over the years and changes in schedule, that stayed a constant. Wednesday was the day at Matan. The learning here was so special and important to her on many different levels. Throughout her illness, my mother gained a lot of strength, knowing that people had her in mind when davening or learning Torah. In addition to all the merits of Limud Torah, learning in her memory, especially here where the learning meant so much to her, is a source of comfort to me. That's her daughter. I hope that it is also a source of strength and comfort to those of you who knew her and feel her loss. I don't want to take any more time from the learning time of this shiur, but with a smile on my face and a tear in my eye, I want to take the opportunity to ask everyone to turn off their phones. Well, great, right? That's very fortunate. Thank you. I did not plan that, right? So, for those of you who don't know, Myrna would stand up, and this, for 15 years, she would stand up at 1 minute to 9 and wave her phone. And after a while, she didn't even have to explain, right? People understood what she was saying. Okay, so I thought that was a very cute ending. All right, so let's start with Bereshit Perek Yochet. I also want to welcome, I see some new faces, and that's also always wonderful. So, we've been talking to those people who have been here for many years until now, but I welcome those people who have recently joined the class and we're really excited, and I would love to meet you. So if you want to come over to me after class and introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Yael, can somebody please post the source?
And the question really is why, right? And it's why do we begin a new parasha? I mean, it clearly is part of a broader unit of Abram, of the Abram stories. We're going to see that many of the parshanim are going to directly connect the events at the beginning of our parsha to the events at the end of the last parsha, which is, of course, we ended last parsha with the mitzvah of milah, right? And as part of the mitzvah of milah, the bracha of the land, which is repeated, and of course, also the change in Abram's name, right? From Abram to Abraham, the change in Sarai's name, and the promise of a child who to Sarai, right? That means excluding Ishmael, who will pick up the bracha, right? Who will receive the bracha of the land. So all of this is the last week's parsha. It really ends with this milah that takes place in Avram's household. And many of the parshanim note that if you look at the beginning of Parak Yud, the beginning of Parak Yud starts with Vayera Elav Hashem. God appeared to him, not Vayera Hashem El Abraham, but Vayera Elav Hashem, which implies that we're in the middle of the story, right? Which we are. We're in the middle of the story. And I think everybody knows, since what everybody knows is Rashi, right? Everybody knows that Rashi explains, why does Hashem come to Abram? What does Rashi say in the wake of the Midrash? Be cordially, right? Abram is suffering. Abram is in pain because of the circumcision. And so this is directly connected to the last parsha, both linguistically, right? And perhaps, also in terms of the theme and explaining why Abraham is visited by God. We'll get back to that point afterwards. So the real question that I want to open with is, I guess it's a question not on the Tanakh, it's a question on those who divided the parsha, right? But presumably, and I'm making this assumption, the parsha were divided with purpose in mind, with understanding. So what is the purpose of creating here a new parsha, especially given that this parsha is linked to the previous parsha? So let's look what the Abarbanel says here. Look at source number 1. I brought for you here. He says,
Yael, we don't have the source sheets.
You see where I am in source number 1? Right? We know, according to the Midrash, that this mar'eh, this revelation of God, is here in order to visit the sick, in order to visit Abram when he's sick, and to cure him from his sickness. So why? Right, that's really his question. Why do we need then to start a new parsha here? So the Abarbanel explains as follows. Kidei la'afsik ben ma shekara la'Abraham b'yoto arel shehu ad sof seder lechacha uven ma shekara lo acharei heyoto ba'al brit la'Elohim v'hu mitchila haseder hazeh v'hala. What is it that the Abarbanel explains? He says, basically, there are two parts in Avram's life. There's the time that he's uncircumcised, and that's all of Parshat Lech Lecha. And then there's post-circumcision Abram. And that's why I call the class from Abram to Abraham, right? Last year we did Abram, right? We spoke about Abram, we spoke about all of the stories that accompany Abram until this, what the Abarbanel is regarding as a critical watershed moment in Abram's life, the moment of Milah. We're going to talk about that a lot today. But the first thing that I want everyone to know, of course, is that what is the first thing that happens to Abram post-Milah? God visits. His house becomes a house of angels, right? His house becomes a house of Hashra'at Hashchina, right? And that, right, the place where God is very present. And that's going to be a very important aspect of Abram in general, right? Obviously, Abram, and maybe I'll just draw your attention to this second source, this midrash here, which is a midrash that appears all over midrashic literature, this idea. So I thought it was an important midrash to bring. The midrash says, Amar Reish Lakish ha'avo hein hamerkava. You're going to see this line all over midrashic literature. The avo are the Merkava. What is the Merkava? Right, we're talking about Yechezkel Parakalo, right? What we call Mazen Merkava, right? What is the Merkava? It's God's throne or God's chariot in this world, right? God is riding on a chariot. What is the chariot that he's riding in? The people, Am Yisrael. This is the question here, or the topic here is, where does God rest his place in this world? And the answer of the Midrash is Am Yavo. And this is the moment that we learn that, right? Shene'emar, at the end of last week's parsha, Vaya'al Elohim me'al Abraham, right? God kind of rose up from Abram. And here, of course, God comes back to Abram. This is the place through which God's revelation comes to the world. Okay, so that's what happens as a result of Milah. If you look at the next Midrash that I brought for you in source number 3, you'll see that the Midrash talks about this circumcision as a very critical moment in all sorts of different contexts. Look at what it says here. Amar Abraham, Ad Shalom Malki, before I circumcised, Hayu ha'oriva shavim ba'inatzli. Right, I had lots of guests, right? So Abram, this is sort of a classic portrayal of Abram sitting in the entrance to his tent. He's longing for guests. He's wanting to host people, right? Would you say that from the time that I circumcised, they're no longer going to visit me? And Abram's nervous. But what Abram's nervous about, as opposed to, I think, what the way that some of the Parshanim presented. Some of the Parshanim presented as, he's in pain from the circumcision, and he's afraid that they're not going to come visit him out of consideration, right? So he's sitting there in the entrance to show that, in fact, he is ready to receive guests. He's eager to receive guests. But this Midrash seems to offer a little bit of a different perspective. He's afraid that now that he's become a man of God, maybe people will be scared off, right? And look at what God's answer is. It's not exactly it's not exactly the answer I think that Abram was looking for, perhaps. But look at what the answer in the Midrash is. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ad Shalom Malka Hayu Bnei Adam Ba'im Etzlecha Anshav Ani B'Chvodi V'Niglalet. Until you were circumcised, lots of people came to you, but now I am coming to visit you. So again, is that comforting to Abram? On one level, certainly, right? As he's become a man of God. What does that mean in terms of his relationship with the world around him? And that's very important in order to understand this chapter, because I think when we think about this chapter that we're about to begin learning, right? So what is the topic of this chapter? Some of the topics are topics that we've already seen, right? And that raises the question, why do we need it again? Like, for example, I think one of the critical questions that we're going to have to deal with, not today, but that we're going to have to deal with in our learning of this chapter is, why do we need again a divine decree or a divine announcement that Abram and Sarah at this point are going to have a child, right? Even though they're elderly, and then they're going to laugh, right? And then, God's going to tell them when that child is going to be born. We already have all of those details in Parakut Zayin. Why is it repeated here? Right? So, different people go in different directions. Clearly here, Sarah is the focus of the angelic pronouncement. We won't get into that right now, but what happens later in the chapter is, after the 3 angels come to Abram and tell Abram and Sarah that they're going to have a child, after that, God says, shall I cover up that which I'm about to do from Abram? And then he tells Abram what he intends to do in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's Abram's reaction? Right? This is really, I think this is one of the great moments in Tanakh. Abram's reaction is to advocate on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, who are Ra'im Achatayim Hashem Me'od, right? As we know already from Parakut Gimel, right? Abram certainly knows that these are unworthy people, and yet Abram is still very clearly interacting with these people, right? He's clearly interested in being part of humanity. And that's also, I think, a very significant point, because of course, Abram, as the newly circumcised Baal Brit, right? He becomes the Baal Brit of God. He becomes the partner of God. He's in a covenant with God. And yet he still continues to regard his covenant with humans, with mankind, with the world around him as being of critical importance. This is one of the things that the Midrash talks about that sets off Abram from Noah, right? Remember that, right? Noah is a tzaddik, no question about it. But he's a tzaddik who is interested in being a tzaddik before God. He's not interested in interacting, or certainly not advocating for a sinful humanity, right? And Abram never loses that sense of his connection to the world around him. Now, for the Rashar Hirsch, which I brought for you here in source number 4, this is a very, very important aspect of Abram, because it becomes very important for Hirsch's kind of philosophic approach to Judaism, right? Rav Hirsch is very much, he's born in the 19th century. He lives throughout, I think he's born in 1800 or 1801, right? And he lives very much integrated in the world of Germany, right? He believes in Torah in Derech Eretz, right? He believes in living in a world with Torah. And it concerns him greatly that someone would think that Jews live their lives separate, distinct, not distinct, but separate, closed off from the world around them. Look at what he says here. Look at what he says about this story and how it presents Avram's Milah. You see where I am? Source number 4. Kama merushat hi hatalat hadohi biyadut v'noseha. How evil is this attempt to try to cast aspersions on Judaism and those who bear Judaism? Elohim nachalat Abraham v'yorsheha. We're talking about that which we possess, that's which we have inherited from Abraham. What is it that people say? Okay, so Rashar Hirsch is quoting, again, we said Rashar Hirsch is very well integrated into the society around him, and he is quoting what people say about the Jewish people. Nimomin ele ro'im atzman b'ga'avatam ki yechidim le'elohehem. These circumcised ones, right? These people who are circumcised, they see themselves in their pride as unique to their God. Ot habrit, the sign of the covenant, and mitziva otam michutz l'shar ha'umot, which places them outside of the other nations. Masir milibam kol rayon shel shutafut klal olami. It takes out of their hearts any semblance of partnership with the world, with humanity. Any sort of connection, any sort of unity with the world. They narrow the focus of the God of the heavens and earth. They think that the God of the whole world is really only their God, and they are special and they are unique, right? And of course, I think he would agree that there is something unique about the relationship between God and his people. But look at what he says specifically about circumcision. But here, the first Jewish circumcised person sits. Where is he sitting? Look in Bereshit Perek Yud Pasuk Aleph. Vayirah Elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei v'hu yoshev petach ha'ohel yechom hayom. Right? God appears to him in Elonei Mamrei. We mentioned already. He's sitting at the entrance to the Ohel. V'hechanu yoshev. I'm going back to Rashar Hirsch. Be'elonei Mamrei. U'nimtza adayin im aner eshkol u'mamrei shehayulo. That's a typo. Shehayulo anshe brito. Oh, sorry. Shehayulo anshe brito. It's not a typo. Ella ba'alei brit Abraham. Right? he is sitting still in the place where he has the Baalei Brit Abraham, his friends, who he has a covenant with them. These are not Jews, right? Aner and Eshkol and Mamre. These are not circumcised ones. And Abram continues to sit there in this place even after the circumcision. Right? They included Abraham in their group, Lamrot she'ata Abraham, hu nimo. And in spite of the fact that now Abram is circumcised, notru yachasad im bnei min ha'enoshi michutz latchum hamitzumtzam shelo v'lo shelo. Right? Abram remains still in contact with all of his former friends, right? It's like sort of the classic story of the Baal Tshuva, right? Does he, then distance himself from everyone that he knew before? I'm a new person now, and I have nothing to do with that, right? So Rosh Hashanah would say, certainly not. That's not what Abram did. Certainly Abram is in a new place spiritually, but he still maintains his former ties. I'm going on in Rosh Hashanah. שדאגתו היחידה של אברהם, זו שהביאה אותו לשבת בפתח האוהל כחום היום, היא שמא עתה בעקבות מילתו הימנעו הבריות את עצמם ממנו. That's what we just read, right? Chazal teaches that Abram's only concern after his circumcision was, will people stop coming to me? Will people no longer, will the people in the surroundings, will they no longer visit me? Right? He cites this midrash that we saw before. Right? This is a very, I think it's a kind of astounding thing that we learned from Abram. We're going to see it afterwards, right? But what Rosh Hashanah says, and this is very characteristic of Rosh Hashanah, she's always looking for the lessons that we're meant to learn from the different stories and how to apply them to his time, right? Our current lives, right? Which is what we do as well. He said the lesson that we are meant to learn from the story of Abram is that hosting guests, treating human beings well, is even more important than hosting God. This is a quote from Chazal. Now, not everybody I think would necessarily be comfortable with this statement, and it's going to very much depend on how we understand the exegesis of the story. But I'll just give you a little bit of the backdrop, which is that in Pasuk Aleph, God appears to Abram, and in Pasuk Bet, people appear to Abram, and Abram turns and takes care of the people without a so much as by your leave, right? He doesn't really, ask God's permission. He sees the people, he gets up, he runs, he goes out, and Chazal learned from this, it is more important to do hachnasat orchim than to commune with God, right? Bein adam l'chavero is more important than bein adam l'makom. Janice?
And I can understand, I don't know how to put this. The Haredim in a specific way do the opposite.
Okay, so okay. Yeah.
That's okay.
Okay.
And I don't know, I Magisha on the people of that time, what I see now, but the communities probably were somewhat insular.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll repeat the question for the comment for the purpose of Zoom, that there are communities that seem to take a different stance, and there are certainly communities that are insular. And what we're going to see, of course, is that everything is a balance, right? There's, all of, I think, the Tanakh is trying to strike a good balance between different values. There certainly is no way that we're meant to learn from this that bein adam l'makom isn't important. Right? And there's certainly no way that we can learn from this that the only way that you can live is, a full life is by not being insular, because maybe insularity sometimes has its merits, right? Even what I said before about, the Baal Tshuva who, leaves aside their former friends. There's room for that sometimes, right? A lot depends on what is the nature of the relationship. If Aner, Eshkol, and Mamre had been influencing Abram for bad before the circumcision, I would certainly expect Abram to detach from them. But Abram is here teaching us that there is value in relationships with the outside world, in seeing yourself as responsible for the outside world. Does it work for every community and every period in history? No, it doesn't. And each community and each individual has to make their decision as to how to strike that balance. And that's, I think, ultimately the message of the Tanakh. The message of the Tanakh is not, you must do X, but here's our values, right? Here's the range of values. You have to take into account that Ben Adam L'Chavero is something that's so important that it becomes the first thing that Abram focuses on after the circumcision. Does that mean that Ben Adam L'Makom is not important? Does that mean that always, whenever we have those two values which conflict, we will always choose Ben Adam L'Chavero? Not necessarily, right? But that these two values are meant to be held in, in some kind of balance all the time. And that's what we're seeing here. Again, I think that part of the things that I like to emphasize are those things which I find unexpected, right? Because I would expect Abram to stay with God, right? And the fact that Abram, at least according to one reading, which we'll talk about at greater length, that Abram, is sitting there with God, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, gotta go, right? Like, going off to take care of these three strangers. That's an amazing moment. That's an amazing moment because that shows us how deeply embedded these values are in Abram's life. And that's what we're interested in, okay? Which again, is itself a kind of a machloket among the different parshanim, is how exactly we do it. Yeah.
I'm not really sure that Hashem oversaw every conversation was recorded. I think this is what Hashem wants. It could have been a conversation that went
Okay, we're going to get to that too. Yeah, Esther is saying maybe there was some kind of conversation between God and Abraham, right? And certainly there is an attempt to read it in to Pasuk Gimel, right? There's again, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but if you look at Pasuk Gimel, right, after, let's just read Pasuk Ben, right? Vayisayina, Vayar, right? He lifts up his eyes, Abraham, as he often does, and he sees V'hinei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav. And there are these three men that are standing above him. And he runs to greet them from the entrance of the tent. And he bows to the ground. And he says, Adonai, my masters, if I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by your servant. You should take some water, etc. Now, some of the Parshanim suggest that Pasuk Gimel is him turning back to God, right? It's not a bad reading. It's also not a Pshat reading, clearly not a Pshat reading. But it's a nice kind of attempt to find Abram's balance a little bit differently than the way that I just presented it, which is that, just explain it a little bit more in detail, which is that Abram sees the men, he runs to the men, and then he remembers, he turns around, he says, wait, God, just don't leave me, right? I'll be back in a minute, right? And then he turns back to that's why he says, Adonai, inna matzati beinecha, al natavor me'al abdecha. What is this? Is this Chol or Kodesh, right? Which we're going to talk about as well. This is an important exegetical question. That word, right? Usually I only say Shem Hashem when I say the whole pasuk, right? So, that's why I just said the whole pasuk, but it's really machloket, whether or not that is Shem Hashem. If he's talking to the men, then it's just my masters, right? If he's talking to God, then it's Shem Hashem. And this is a very, very big machloket. But according to this reading, this is a buyer lead. The problem with the reading, and the reason that I'm not willing to accept it as the pshat, is because it runs into the next pasuk without any explanation that now he's turning back to the men. In other words, there's absolutely no indication that pasuk Gimel and pasuk Daled has a different addressee. It seems to be that Abram is speaking to the three men. But things are going to get even more complicated. So we'll leave that aside for a few more minutes. Let's look back at the end of this Rosh Hirsch. I think, again, it's a very nice introduction to Rosh Hirsch. I think some of you who have been with me for many, many years know that I never brought a Rosh Hirsch into class until Breshit Perek Aleph, right? Some of you noticed that, I think, and even mentioned it. Rashar Hirsch is absolutely astounding in Bereshit. I mean, and there's no class that goes by that we don't do one or two or three ideas of Rashar Hirsch. He's so adept. He's so adept at taking the ideas of the story and translating them into practical and I think really deep concepts that we can apply. So that's, you know, that's why we really do see him a lot. And this is, I think, a good introduction to him. Right, let's go on here. After the words Gdolach, Nasat Orchim Me'achbalat Pnei Hashchina, Umi Hayu Ha'orchim she'Abram tzipah lahem. Who were the guests that Abram was going to greet, that Abram was anticipating, that he was sitting and waiting for at the entrance to the tent? Ovdei Elilim Arelim. Right? Uncircumcised idolaters. That's who he thinks they are. I mean, obviously, you can't expect anybody circumcised because circumcision just happened for the first time. And in his own household, and for their sake, he was even willing to leave God. He runs to greet them. We're going to skip a little bit ahead. I mean, I skipped a little bit ahead where Rashar Hirsch kind of brings this down to us. Amot shel Abraham, hamivudadim al yedei hamila, the nation of Abram, who are separated because of by circumcision. Atidim liot bnei adam ha'enoshiyim bioter, are in the future meant to be. I mean, I think he says are, right? That's what it means to say, right? I would like to paraphrase a little bit and say, are meant to be the most human concerned people. I don't think he means humane here with the word enoshim. I think because that's how we use it, right? Enoshim, we use to mean humane. I think he's saying the most human focused people. Misodam mehavim hem nigud l'shar ha'olam. They are a contrast to what's going on in the rest of the world. Right? They are standing on in their own place, and at the same time, they're always willing to act for the entire world, to advocate on behalf of the world. So at the end, what you see here is that Rashar Hirsch notes the balance, right? There's nobody that would deny that there's a strong chord in the Tanakh that encourages bididut, right? Am livadad yishkom, and then that's what Janice was saying before. There is a certain kind of strain or a certain path of singularity that Am Yisrael is meant to adopt, that Am Yisrael is meant to follow. And at the same time, that is not meant to take them out of the world, but it's meant to strengthen them in order to properly contribute to the world, in order to properly become part of the world with, I think, perhaps the backbone, the strength to remain different and singular, even while at the same time interacting with the world. And that's really, I think, this is almost Rashar Hirsch's manifesto, right? And the other one who I think would very much sign off on this, I mean, there are a lot of people that would sign off on this, but the other one who turns this really into something which is a central part of their thought is, of course, Rav Sams, right? Talks about this all the time. I don't recall him ever citing this particular Rashar Hirsch, but this would certainly be something that if it were written in Rav Sachs's name, I would believe that he had written, right? This is something that you see just over and over in his writings. Yeah.
So 59 is a very private thing. So how would you know you circumcised and you're not?
Oh, just simply that circumcision only came into play, certainly as a God-given decree 5 minutes ago, right? It only is that what you're asking? Oh, you're asking in terms of Rashar Hirsch.
No. I don't understand if you presume that there or not, or
right.
How would you know that somebody circumcised or not?
Right. Yeah, no, but you what he's saying is that the assumption of Abram is that he's dealing with idolaters because that's the world out there. He's dealing with uncircumcised, and yet he still is willing to act without any boundaries in terms of his kindness to them, in terms of his compassion to them. Did I answer the question? Did I miss something?
How would they even know?
Oh, how would he know if they were circumcised, if his friends were circumcised? Oh, now I understand the question. How would the world know that Abram is circumcised after the circumcision? You know, either they do or they don't. It's possible that this is because Abram has a large household and he circumcised everybody in his household, right? Not just himself, but also Ishmael and also Levi, right? And everybody in his house is circumcised. So maybe, perhaps, it was something that became a shem davar, right? People found out about it. But even if not, Rosh Hashanah is not talking about Abram. He's talking about us, right? He's talking about what eventually transpires in the world. And circumcision actually became one of those topics that was a great source of tension between Jews and Christians in the period of early Christianity, right? So, I mean, I guess this is maybe a holdover from that when non-Jews looked at Jews, right? What was it that they were saying about them? What was sort of the classic, I mean, just open the paper and look at what was his name? Kanye West. And the classic things that people say about Jews, but certainly in a time that the world was more religious, right? So one of the things that they didn't like about Jews was circumcision, because it was a source of tension between Christians and Jews in early Christianity times. So perhaps that's what he's picking up on. But that's not the main focus of what he's saying. He's not really talking about, yeah. That what? Yeah, absolutely, right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So this is so this whole approach. There are some chairs down here if you want to come down. You're invited. So this whole approach of Rosh Hashanah, I think, just really supports what we're seeing until now, which is that the story of Abram post-circumcision is not a story that pulls him out of humanity. It's not something that hermetically seals him off from everybody else, but rather it's something which pushes him forward to assume his role vis-a-vis humanity as now a person who is a ben brit of God. Now, I want to, though, take one kind of exception to Rashar Hirsch's point. Right? Rashar Hirsch said, he's still sitting in Elonei Mamre. But I do want to point out that his friends are not mentioned here, right? He's in Elonei Mamre, but I don't see Amer or Eshkol or Mamre himself. So I want to say two things about this. Number one is that never again are we going to see Abram being called Baalei Brit Mamre, right? Now, he will make a brit with Avimelech, but that's a political treaty, right? Abram is encouraged to have political connections with others, but the idea of being a Baal Brit, right? Someone who is in some kind of deep existential partnership, that's been replaced by God, right? He is now Baal Brit Hashem. Okay, so that I think is point number one that I wanted to make. And the other point that I think that is important to make here is a point that Rashi makes. Look at Rashi here in source number 5. V'rachatzu raglechem, right? When he says to these strangers, wash your feet, right? Kasavur shehem Aravim. He thinks that they are Arabs. Shemishtachavim le'avak raglechem. That worship the dust of their feet. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I mean, I just practically speaking, did the Arabs worship the dust of maybe? That what?
They came along.
Yeah.
Where did they down?
Yeah. I don't know. That's just a side point, right? But the point that Rashi's making is much more significant. Let's see, Abram was very careful not to allow any idolatry to enter his house. Later on, we're going to see the Lot story, which is going to be very much parallel to the Abram story. And Lot is not careful about this. He first told them they could lodge with him, and only afterwards did he make them wash their hands. And that's the difference between Abram and Lot. And this, again, I think this is a remarkably important balance, right? Because we have this sense, if you look at Abram in Pasuk Aleph, right? He's sitting at the entrance to his tent. He gets up from the entrance to his tent and runs to these strangers. So he's willing to cross boundaries to go to the strangers, but he never invites them into his tent. And he makes them wash their feet before they can actually, kind of have some kind of contact with him. And so what Rashi is pointing out here is that there's a balance, right? It's what we were saying before. Yes, you want to maintain a strong relationship with the outside world. You want to assume your responsibility vis-a-vis the outside world, but you're not allowing idolatry to come into your house, right? And that's something that, Abraham is balancing here. And that's also in answer to Janice's comment before, right? So there's a constant sense of balance in the Tanakh about everything. And that's one of the reasons that I really appreciate the Tanakh, because it's always very nuanced, right? It's always very nuanced. And here as well, there is a sense of acknowledging one's differentness and maintaining a strong singularity internally, but at the same time, allowing yourself to cross over that boundary and going to others. Yeah, Mariam.
Wouldn't it be that Lot invited them in first, but because they were in danger, staying outside, they come in first and then watch it?
It certainly could be. And when Rashi brings this in the wake of the Midrash, right? When Rashi brings these ideas, he's bringing it as an idea. He's not saying this is the only reason, it's the exclusive reason. He's trying to explain that there is a difference between Abram and Lot in terms of their willingness to allow evil things to penetrate their household. And this is a very important and astute comment, because ultimately Lot, for all of his similarity to Abraham, is going to create a family that's going to look a lot more like stone than like Abram's family. And Lot himself looks more like Abraham. So what happened with Lot? What happened with Lot is that Lot, this is what Rashi said, right? It's not the only way to understand it, but Rashi's suggesting here, again, subtly, this is the way Rashi suggests things, that Rashi, or the Midrash suggests things. Rashi's saying here, well, look at what Lot did. Lot allowed these negative ideas to permeate into the household. Okay, all right, I'm going to stop. Yeah, go ahead.
Lot had a very perverse comprehension of what God commanded, because when a little further on, when the neighbors want to take his guests out, he said, I have to protect my guests, but you can break my daughters.
Yeah. Okay. So Baya is pointing out that Lot has a certain perversity that we're going to see later that we're not going to like. And there's no doubt about it that we're not going to like that. Again, the Ramban is going to say, Mitoch shivcho shel ha'ish banu lignuto, right? We start with this wonderful story, and in the end, it becomes a horror story, right? Is that Lot's fault? Does he have the wrong kinds of values? Or is he what we would call between a rock and a hard place, right? His original decision to live amongst Sodom and Gomorrah that ultimately becomes his the reason for his fall. I think that's what Rashi is suggesting here. But we're gonna examine Lot at great length, right? And certainly Lot has his detractors, right? The Midrash does not particularly like Lot. Many of the Midrashim, Rashi is not a great fan of Lot. Radak loves Lot. Go figure. So I mean, obviously until that moment, and then things go awry. But where's the moment of Lot's downfall, right? And I think Rashi's making a really strong point here, one that is very strongly rooted in the story, which is that he let those idolaters too close. He didn't put the mechitzot, right, the separations. He didn't make it clear enough. And Abram, he makes it very clear. So if you look at some of the subtle differences between Abram hosting guests and Lot hosting guests, you're going to get to the real story. That's what Rashi is suggesting here. Okay. I'm going to pause questions, just so we can move ahead, and unless it's a clarity question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so Rashi says, look, the significance of washing the feet. Oh, sorry. What is the significance of washing the feet? I assume, right? Okay, so Rashi says that the significance of washing the feet is specifically about idolatry. But obviously the shot is that I said I don't even particularly understand that, which I still don't. But the shot, of course, is what you were saying before. They've come from a long journey, right? It's basic manners to give people food, drink, and the ability to clean themselves up, right? They're presumably, they're walking barefoot, right? People don't have shoes. They're walking in the dusty sand. Before they can eat, they want to wash off. That's really what it's about. It's part of the chesed that Abram is doing. It's part of the experience of hosting people. That's really, I think, the practical idea. They're what?
They're walking in dough.
Yeah, they're walking in silk. Okay, now this balance that we've seen here with Abram. Maybe I'll mention just one more thing before we go on, and that is that we mentioned that the story of Lot is very parallel to Abram. I just want to point out something that we're going to talk about as we progress through this chapter and the next chapter, and that is that this story of Abram that begins in Perek Yud continues all the way to the end of Yud Tet. Okay, this is not the separation of the chapters, the division of the chapters. You've heard me say it a million times. It's not our division, right? That's a Christian division that has nothing to do with any sort of Jewish tradition, aside from the fact that when you have a parsha, ptucha or stuma, right? You have those open parshiot. Sometimes they help divisions of chapters, but here between Perek Yud and the end of Perek Yud Tet, it is one long unbroken parsha, right? You see it? Just flip through, right? And in fact, it is one parsha. This entire story takes place over the course of 24 hours. Okay, these three strangers, these three guests who come to Abram, and Abram, takes them into the house, and then they give him a bracha of continuity, and then they tell Abram about Sodom and Gomorrah. The next thing we find ourselves in Sodom and Gomorrah, with the same guests being hosted by Abram's nephew, and the story ends with Lot's continuity. Okay, it takes Abram a really long time to implement God's bracha, right? We saw that a lot last year, right? God gives him a bracha of fertility of land, he gives him a bracha of fertility of people. That's Birchat Abraham, right? And what does Abram not have? He doesn't have fertility of his wife, right? For a very long time. When Hagar finally has a child, God says, no, right? And God keeps promising him, but it takes a really long time for this promise to come to fruition, which is the story of the Jewish people. Right? Oh, because you'll see, there's lots and lots of time frames, but the fact that it's one story, I think, is really very much indicated not just by the unbroken nature of the story in terms of the parsha, Ptucha, and Stuma, but also by the fact that it's the same players later in the story. It's the same topics, right? So this is one long unbroken story. That's the side point. Okay, I want to go back to the balance of the Abram.
Or thought of that Lot also had circumcision, or Lot isn't the one?
That's a good question. Janice asked, is there any possibility that Lot is circumcised? It's a good question. There's no indication at all. No, there might be an answer. There's no indication at all that Lot is circumcised, which leads us to believe that he's not, right? He has not taken the full journey with Abram. He has emerged from Abram's household with certain Abram-like values, right? No question about it. Certain Abram-like values. Can I ask you a favor? I just realized I don't have a watch and I don't have my phone here and I have no idea what time it is. 50. Okay, you'll give me a heads up when we're finding this way. Okay, fine. Okay, so going back to this balance that Abram does, and again, one of the wonderful things. One of the wonderful things in this story. Okay, one of the wonderful things in this story is what I said before, which is that Abram begins to function as an advocate of the world later on in this story. I think that what we would really say is that starting from this story, Abram becomes a Navi, right? That certainly is the way that some of the Parshanim look at it. Look, for example, in source number 6. This is again Rosh Hashanah. He says, Zohi hapam harishona. You see where I am? Zohi hapam harishona. Anu rohim et Abraham b'tafkido k'navi. Right? This is the first time that we see Abram functioning as a Navi. What is a Navi? Right? What does it mean? Abram's had connection with God until now. Right? God has appeared to Abram over and over and over. This is not the first time that he gets a prophecy, that he gets a message from God. And Abram has had contact with people over and over. Look what he said. Because he is standing before God to receive God's secret, right? God is revealing to Abram Asher Ani Oseh, that which he intends to do. What is the ideal Navi, right? There's a famous midrash. It's a very old midrash. It's one that is often cited by later midrashim and parshanim. And the midrash tells us, Shlosha banim, which I'll paraphrase to mean, there are 3 different kinds of prophets, because that's what the midrash means. There's a prophet who is Tobea et Kvod ha'am, velo et Kvod haben. There is the prophet that represents God, but not Am Yisrael, right? That wants to advocate on behalf of God, but not Am Yisrael. Who's that? Eliyahu. Good. Yes, Eliyahu. He has no interest in advocating on behalf of a sinful nation, but he very much wants to be in contact with God, right? That's when he goes to the tops of mountains and he sits up there waiting for God to sort of take him in a chariot of fire up to the sky, right? The second type of prophet is Tovea et Kvod haben, velo et Kvod ha'am. He only wants to advocate before the people to God, but he doesn't really want to bring God's harsh messages to the people. Who's that? Yonah, right? Yonah. He's an easier prophet to kind of absorb, but he's also not the ideal prophet. And then there's the ideal prophet, the one who is Tovea et Kvod ha'am, ve'et Kvod haben. It's a Mechilta, is the Rabbi Ishmael, right? The one who wants to represent both God and Am Yisrael, and is constantly balancing. That's Abram, right? This is what makes him a Navi. The ability to balance, ben adam el chavero and ben adam el makom. The desire to be both all the time, man of God and man among men, right? Who is the example that the Midrash brings for the ideal prophet? It's surprising. I know you're thinking, everyone's thinking Moshe, which is of course the right answer. And Abram's the right answer. But that's not actually the answer that the Midrash brings. Yirmiyahu, right? Yeah, it's a remarkable answer because Yirmiyahu is not the one I would have picked, because Yirmiyahu has such a hard time vis-a-vis people that at some point in Sefer Yirmiyahu, he becomes extremely agitated about the people and he asks God to kill some of them, right? He's very much, there's tense relations between Yirmiyahu and the people, to put it mildly. I'm not going to get into right now.
Ended up, even though he lost, getting the influence he wanted, he went with the people into exile that they chose.
Yeah, okay, so that is one point. That Yirmiyahu in the end goes with the people into exile, and therefore he continues to support them, although that wasn't a particularly successful relationship either, even once they get to Mitzrayim. But what's interesting really about that midrash and the way that it chooses Yirmiyahu is that the pasuk that it cites is not from Sefer Yirmiyahu. It's from Megillat Eicha. For more on this, I know a book. Anyway, so no, I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm always tempted to talk about Eicha, but I'm not going to talk about it right now. But what I do think is that Abram is really the model for this, right? It starts really here, right? That's what Rosh Hashanah means to say when he says this is really the beginning of of proper nivu'ah, not because God didn't speak to humans before, but because this manner of positioning Abraham between his responsibilities to God and his responsibilities to his fellow humans, that's nivu'ah. The ultimate nivu'ah is the one who can hold these two things in balance and continue, I think, really passionately advocating for both at the same time, even when they come into conflict with each other, right? Because Abram, I think, is very much in support of God's tzedek and mishpat that he's looking for. That's why God chooses him, right? You know, I know you, and I know you're going to give over tzedek and mishpat to the world. And yet, despite that, Abram knows that Sodom and Amorah are the antithesis of tzedek and mishpat, and yet, despite that, he still tries with the last vestiges of his energy to try to save them. Can we find in them any semblance of tzedek and mishpat? That's the ultimate navi. Okay, that's what Rasha Hirsch said. Yeah.
Could you reference the midrash?
The midrash is in Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. It's in Parshat Shalach, and I just don't remember offhand the number of the midrash, but it's really easy to find. You just go to Professor Google and type in Echad Tovea et Kavod Ha'av ve'Echad Tovea et Kavod Haben, and the midrash will come.
My second point about that, the use of the word Av and Ben disturbs me because it sounds so Christian. It sounds very Christian.
Oh no, the Christians get it from us. I'll repeat the comment for soon, right? The use of Av and Ben sounds Christian. Absolutely not, right? But we are Banima of God all over Tanakh. God is both father figure and mother figure throughout Tanakh. Am Yisrael are the children. For more on this, see Shirat Ha'azinu, but it's all over Tanakh, right? I mean, really, it's all. Yeah, exactly. Everything, a lot of things that sometimes we feel are very Christian, you find them in Tanakh, like turn the other cheek, that kind of thing, right? Eicha Perek Gimel. Okay. Somehow we come back to it. Okay, I'm not going to read source number 7, but I do want to reference source number 7, and you can read it on your own. Here's where Rashar Hirsch makes a comment about the way that people think about prophecy and what prophecy really is. These kinds of things really disturb Rav Shimshon Hirsch. And he here says, most people think, or many people think, prophecy is some kind of ecstatic moment when you go into some kind of, state of ecstasy. I would put it a little bit differently. I mean, that's Rashar Hirsch's way of putting it. I would say a lot of people think prophecy is you sit with your crystal ball in this like sort of Harry Potter like moment. Right? So Rashar Hirsch is very concerned about that, and he says, look where Abram was when he got prophecy for this first time. He calls this the first prophecy. He says he was sitting in his house, hosting guests, living a normal life, and he gets this message from God. He's not in any sort of ecstatic state, and Rashar Hirsch likes to debunk certain attitudes that he thinks are in fact wrong. Yeah. Oh, my speaker is off. This. Wait, if Zoom is complaining. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. All right. For the remainder of this class, I want to address what. Yeah.
So would we not consider the acting concerning where that's not prophecy? You have to repeat for the
yes.
group.
Oh, thank you, Esther. Would Rashar Hirsch not consider the Brit Bein HaBetarim prophecy? So again, he says this is the first prophetic kind of, I would say prophetic appointment, which is not to say that Abram didn't have moments of receiving Devar Hashem. He's really here specifically talking about prophetic appointment. But your question is still a good question. What would Rashar Hirsch do with Perek Tedvav, the Brit Bein HaBetarim, which seems very mysterious and very similar to what he seems to be saying prophecy is not, right? It's not to say, I think what Rashar Hirsch is trying to say is that the prophetic relationship is not about taking yourself out of the world. It's a similar kind of thing that he was saying about circumcision, right? He's saying, here's Abram doing the most mundane thing that you could imagine, right? Sitting in his tent, making food, and this results in the first prophetic appointment, not lying on the floor, in some sort of ecstatic state, trying to receive prophecy. You might receive prophecy that way, but that's not the essence of prophecy. It's a really good point. Whether it applies to every single description of prophecy in Tanakh, it certainly does not. But I think the point he's trying to make is still a well-taken point. Yeah.
What seems to be the Rambam's understanding that this was all a dream? That it is outside and sitting in her.
Okay, good. Good. Okay, so I will repeat that. What would the Rosh HaHirsch do with the fact that the Rambam, and in the wake of the Rambam, Radak, sees this entire story as just a dream? So he would not accept that, right? Absolutely not. As the Ramban does not accept it, as I think the Ramban pretty convincingly, presents lots and lots and lots of objections to that approach. We'll get to it next time. This whole story, this whole story from the beginning, from the tent, all the way through the end of Lod. Because for the Rambam, the idea of an angelic being actually appearing in corporeal form to a human being is impossible, right? It's unlikely, or much more than that. It's what we say in Hebrew, hazui, right? And so, okay, so yeah. Well, that's what the Rambam's saying. The Nevuah is also in a dream, and so this is a dream. We'll get to it, right? We will get to it. It's an approach. It's not an approach that most of the Parshanim are comfortable with, but certainly it is one approach. What I want to deal with for the remainder of today's class is the question of one of the main questions of Perek Yosef Pasuk Al Vayira Elav Hashem Be'elunei Mamrei Hu Yosef Petach Ha'ol Kechol Mayom. God appears to him, and then he doesn't say anything to him. But this doesn't bother us because we're so influenced by Rashi, right? We all know the answer to the question already. But let's start with the question, right? Let's erase Rashi for a moment. We'll get back to him in a moment, right? And ask the question: that why did God come to him? Vayira Elav Hashem. Now, Chizkuni points out, and it's a very important comment. Chizkuni says every time it says Vayira Elav Hashem, the next word is Vayomer. And that's what we expect, right? God comes to someone, he appears to someone, and he tells him something. Okay, there are three ways to go with this. One is that the Vayomer only appears much later, right? He comes to him, then Abram gets interrupted, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit next time. And then he speaks to him, right? Then he tells him, this is why I came. By the way, I came to tell you about stone. Or, I came to tell you about Sarah having a child, right? It's possible that the Vayomer is later. But there are two other approaches to this, which are...
I'm sorry, who said the first one?
Which first one?
Who said, I'm sorry, who says...
Oh, we're going to talk about it a little bit next time who says it, because there's two ways to understand it. So I'm just going to leave that as a sort of, an obvious solution to the problem, is that, Abram gets interrupted or God gets interrupted before he tells him the message, right? Okay, I'm not going to go into it too much because I don't want to complicate matters today. But the other two ways I do want to talk about, right? The other two ideas, which are not, oh, thank you for giving me the 5-minute, I have a watch now. Thanks to Esther. But the other two approaches, which are complementary, right? They don't contradict each other. The first approach is the well-known approach, which is the Bikur Cholim approach, which is what Rashi cites based on the Midrash that I brought for you in source number 9. Abarbanel, by the way, I brought for you the question via Abarbanel in source number 8, right? Where he asks the question, which is really, I think, the major question. What is the reason that God appeared to Abram? There's no words, and there's no command, and there's nothing that follows this appearance. What's the purpose of this appearance? So the first answer is God came to visit the sick. Okay. Now, some of the support for this is obviously the juxtaposition between this story and the Milah story, and the fact that this story opens with Vayira Elav Hashem, right? Elav, right? It doesn't have to mention Abram because we're still in the same story. We're still a continuation of the Milah story. Ramban is going to go so far as to say, not only did he come to visit him, but he came to cure him from his circumcision. And how do we know? Well, first of all, as we know, every visit of Bikur Cholim takes a little bit of the pain away, right? And God's visit, you can imagine, takes a lot of the pain away, right? So God comes to cure him. How do we know that God came to cure him? Because look at him later on. He's running. He's in Bechol Hayom. He's making food. He's going back and forth from this tent to that tent, right? So he's cured. Okay, so that's one approach. And of course, from this we learn, this is one of the sources where we learn imitatio Dei, right? The chol drachecha de'ehu. We are required to imitate God. Mahu mivaker cholim, afatam mivaker cholim, right? Just like God visits the sick, so too we go visit the sick. There's a beautiful idea. How do we attain some kind of shadow of the divine? Is by acting with compassion, right? Because that's God's modus operandi, right? That's God's MO, right? God comes and he visits the sick, so we too must go and visit the sick. The second passage, which I think, again, it's not a contradiction, but it's, I think, a really beautiful idea that stands on its own, even though the Ramban brings both ideas and kind of conflates between them, is that the reason that God doesn't say anything to Abram is because the visit is just a visit. Not a Bikur Cholim visit, just a visit. And that's connected to Milah. That's connected. I'll just make an announcement. Rachel Danziger's Sefer Shemot will be here in the auditorium, and Shani Terragan's Shimshon Shmuel and Shaul class will be in room 1. Okay, so that's just technical, so I don't forget. Okay, but let's just finish up this idea, and then we will, and then we'll end the class for today. And that is that some of the rabbinic sources say, some of the midrashim say that because Abraham had done Brit Milah, his household is now set up for God to visit. And not only that, but just as God appears when we bring a korban, right? Just as God brings his presence when we bring a korban. So when Abraham brings a korban on himself, right? He's metif dam, right? He himself bleeds. So what? God's not going to reveal himself to Abram, having nothing to do with Bikur Cholim. Again, these are not mutually exclusive ideas. Both of these ideas could be simultaneously true. I brought for you a couple midrashim, but let's just skip to Radat Hoffman in source 17. Let's see what he says here, and we'll read one more source after that, and then we'll conclude for the day. Through this covenant, through this brit that just now was convened, Naaseh Abraham, you see where I am in 14? Source number 14?
It's at 17.
Did I? I'm so sorry.
Okay.
14. Naaseh Abraham yoter ra'oi l'kirvat ha'elokim. Abraham became more worthy of God's closeness from what he was before. In kiyum mitzvat hamilah, hukdash kol beito la'avodat Hashem yitbarach. Right? Once the entire household has been circumcised, everyone is consecrated to service of God. L'rabot ha'avadim, including his servants. Mishum kach nitkabed bayit zeh bibikuram shel malachei shamayim. Therefore, this house became worthy of a visit by angels, who acted in Abram's house as if they are human guests, the asher bisru et habisora, etc., etc. Okay, so what happens to Abram's household following circumcision is that it becomes a house of God. It becomes a house where God's presence is very palpably felt. And that's pretty much what we say about Eretz Yisrael, right? It's Hashra'at HaShekhinah. That's what I was saying before about Abram being the Merkavah, right? And so there's something beautiful, I think, about this idea that when we ask ourselves, well, why did God come to Abram? What did he come to tell him? Nothing. God's there. And I'm going to conclude with, I think, a beautiful twist in this idea by Rashar Hirsch, who says, well, you know, it's not that God came to visit Abram after the Brit Milah because suddenly Abram is worthy of it. It's that God was always there, but Abram could only properly discern him after the Brit Milah. Isn't that a beautiful idea? Look at the Rashar Hirsch. I was so excited when I saw this. Look at source 15, but this will conclude. God's presence is always there. Not everyone merits to see it. Only one who consecrates himself to God, just like Abram just did. And so it's almost as though Abram's eyes are open and he looks around. And it reminds me of that moment with Elisha, right? When Elisha's in trouble and then God opens his eyes and he sees that the hills around him are filled with chariots of fire and God is protecting him, right? Sometimes we get to see God, you know, without that, but oftentimes what we really need to do is to sense God's presence in the hills around us, right?
Open your eyes.
Open your eyes, yeah.
How does this integrate with what you were saying about Hagar? That she was able to open her eyes.
Yeah, sometimes. This is a good question, right? How does this fit into Hagar, right? And I would just say, feel free to go. The class is over, but I'm answering questions now. So,
Dr. Ziegler?
So Hagar, I think sometimes finding God comes from a deep crisis. And finding God is not limited at all to the family of Abram or to just people who are, you know, circumcised. If there are any Zoom
Dr. Ziegler,
want to
yes.
ask questions
Dr.
or
Ziegler?
comments,
Hi.
feel
Yael?
free, unmute yourselves.
Dr.
Yeah,
Ziegler?
I do have a question on Zoom. Yael?
Wait, that what? Tell them what? Zoom? I don't hear. Oh, I don't hear.
Dr. Ziegler?
Sorry,
Dr. Ziegler?
I'm muted.
Okay, somebody else is asking a question. Dr.
Oh,
Ziegler?
but we don't hear you yet. So hold on
It's
one second.
it's not
Dennis
unmuted.
fixing it.
Okay.
Yeah.